Okay.
Okay, we're good to go. Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Nice to see so many of you coming out of the sun. Hope you're enjoying this weather while it lasts. Really pleased to welcome back Dan Fox. Many of you will have heard his last talk with us about Jewish men in the military. Today, Dan is talking about casting the dice. His talk is about the Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare. The Special Operations Executive, 1940 to 46. The SOE talk explores how the immigrant and refugee backgrounds of British Jews and Jews from Allied countries during World War II made them ideal for clandestine activity in Nazi-occupied territory. It depicts the bravery and sacrifice of Jews who served in the SOE and the ingenuity and commitment of Jews who supported them from the home front. Dan, welcome, over to you.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm just going to share my screen, and hopefully everybody can see the beginning of those slides now.
Yep.
Yeah,
that's great. Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much indeed for having me back, and thanks for as our host already said, thanks for coming in out of the long-awaited good weather to listen to me this afternoon. My talk today is about extraordinary heroism, courage, ingenuity, and fair to say, I think, madness in the midst of World War II. But first, I want to take us all forward from that about 30 years and to the Shelbourne Hotel in Earl's Court. Today, a luxury boutique establishment, it had been for decades a rather shabby and uncomfortable place, not much more than a hostel really for the waifs and strays of West London, when in 1971, it was taken over by a group of Poles from the community that had established itself in that part of the world during the war. They set about a program of refurbishment and renovation, and in a forgotten storeroom, they found an abandoned trunk. It contained women's clothing, papers relating to service and operations in the 1940s, and this dagger, designed to be concealed in and lethally deployed from the side of a boot. How it got there and who it had belonged to is a big part of our story this afternoon, and that begins in 1938. In 1938, the so-called Stresa front fell. This was the diplomatic facade erected by Britain, France, and Italy to protect the provisions of various post-World War I agreements, including guaranteeing the independence of nations. It had been steadily crumbling throughout the 1930s, and when Hitler completed the Anschluss of Nazi Germany and Austria, it collapsed altogether. War seemed inevitable, an anticipation reinforced by the fall of Czechoslovakia later that year, and in response, three of the institutions in Britain charged with ensuring national security established organisations to explore the various ways in which that war might be fought by less conventional means. The Foreign Office set up a department in Electra House, or EH, to create and promote propaganda. MI6 stood up Section D at the St Ermin's Hotel in St James's to carry out sabotage and paramilitary activities behind enemy lines. And the Ministry of War expanded its military intelligence research team to focus on supporting armed resistance. By 1940, as the Battle of Britain filled our skies and with a few Allied airmen we stood alone against Nazism, Winston Churchill ordered the merger of these organisations. The new unit, based on Baker Street, was called the Special Operations Executive. On 22nd of July, the SOE officially came into being with orders from the Prime Minister to now go and set Europe ablaze. And it was tasked with clandestine and resistance supporting activities in Nazi-occupied territory, such as sabotage, assassination, propaganda, espionage, civil unrest, and anything that, in Churchill's more private words, would rot the buggers from within. It was nicknamed his Ministry for Ungentlemanly Warfare. Even if you've not previously heard of the SOE, you're probably familiar with some of its exploits. For example, Anthropoid, the assassination in Prague of Reinhard Heydrich, and Gunnicide, to destroy Nazi nuclear research facilities in Telemark, Norway, were SOE operations. With its remit established, the SOE needed three things. It needed agents, kit, and ways to communicate. Communications did not just mean the technical requirement of transmitters and receivers, but also a system of ciphers to encode communications and keep its operations and agents safe. Leo Marx was a 22-year-old cryptography enthusiast who wrote letters practically begging to be taken on in the intelligence world. His interest had begun as a child in his father's bookshop, reading Edgar Allan Poe's story The Gold Bug, about hidden treasure concealed by a code. He also deciphered the pricing codes that his dad penciled in the inside covers of the books to guide the haggling with customers. That bookshop, by the way, was Marx & Co., better known as 84 Charing Cross Road. Via decoding work at Bletchley Park, he came to the SOE and amazed instructors with his ability. On one occasion, he was given a test to break a code within 20 minutes. When it took him all day, his suitability was questioned, except the examiner had forgotten to give Leo the code's key as he was supposed to. He cracked it anyway, albeit taking a little longer. When he took over the SOE's cryptography, he found the basic keys were poems chosen by the agents. The problem was that if the poem was well known and could be identified, the enemy could easily break the code. So drawing on his literary background, Marx composed original verses for the agents, his most famous being the one that he gave to the incredible Violette Jarbo, a South London woman married to a Hungarian, who was eventually captured and executed after 2 SOE missions. He wrote it originally for his girlfriend Ruth, who died in a plane crash in 1943. The life that I have is all that I have, and the life that I have is yours. The love that I have of the life that I have is yours and yours and yours. A sleep I shall have, a rest I shall have, yet death will be but a pause. For the peace of my years in the long green grass will be yours and yours and yours. After the war, Marx became a novelist and screenwriter, including of the still controversial 1960 film Peeping Tom. He's pictured here in later years with one of the handkerchiefs issued to SOE agents with disposable keys printed on them. While that technique has not survived to the present, some of the cryptographic procedures and principles he established are still in use by intelligence agencies today. One of the devices used to transmit Marx's code was the biscuit radio, so called because it could fit in and be made to look like a tin of biscuits. Indeed, this new form of war required all sorts of new types of equipment and gadgetry. These were developed in 17 experimental or scientific sections, overseen by a new unit of the Military Intelligence Research Team called MD1 and nicknamed Churchill's Toy Shop. Their products were straight out of the movies. A one-shot pistol disguised as a pipe, foot-shaped boots coverings to mask beach landings, early scuba rigs, fake logs for concealment, explosive rats, cyanide capsules, and fountain pen daggers, to name but a few. Forgery also played a huge role in both the everyday SOE operations and its wider role supporting psychological operations, propaganda, and disinformation. Elik Howe, known as Armin Hull, was from a Russian Jewish family and was an expert in German printing processes, knowing exactly which machinery, inks, and media to use to recreate the enemy's documents. He worked with Sefton Delmer, a former Oxford-educated journalist who had been born to Australian Jewish parents in Berlin. He was the first British journalist to secure an interview with Hitler and was with him when he inspected the Reichstag fire. Throughout the 1930s, Samuel was suspected of being a Nazi spy, but was to prove that accusation very wrong. In September 1940, he was recruited by the SOE to organize black propaganda broadcasts. They included a false radio station for the German armed forces. Delmer's propaganda stories included spreading rumors that foreign workers were sleeping with the wives of German soldiers serving overseas. When the cabinet minister Stafford Cripps discovered this, he wrote to Anthony Eden, the foreign secretary, that if this is the sort of thing that is needed to win the war, why, I'd rather lose it. Cripps was, needless to say, and luckily, ignored. Delmer created the character of Vicky, a fake German equivalent of Vera Lynn, played by Agnes Bernell, a Jewish refugee from Berlin. Vicky became the singing sweetheart of the German Navy, broadcasting out letters, birthday greetings, and congratulations on the birth of a new son and daughter, but only to sailors on ships that had already been away for more than a year. When a U-boat captain heard news of his wife giving birth to twins, despite his 2-year absence, he surrendered his vessel to return to his family. On another occasion, Vicky also caused chaos in the German post office by announcing that the Fuhrer himself required all good citizens to send samples of urine to the Ministry of Health. Agnes lived quite the life after the war, with a successful career in acting and music, including earning the epithet of Ireland's oldest punk. I'd recommend Googling her. One of the schemes that Selma and Hull worked up together was fake stamps with subtle and not so subtle subversive messages to be issued to SOE agents for use in the Reich's territories. This included a new 6 Pfennig stamp, which replaced Hitler with Himmler, and a stamp parodying one which celebrated the 20th anniversary of Goering's command of the Sturmabteilung by instead commemorating the hanging of von Witzleben, one of the perpetrators of the July plot to assassinate Hitler. The forging teams also created official papers. Here is one they made as an example of their work, a passport for a Mr. Adolf Hitler, giving him a visa for Jews into Mandate Palestine, and entering his occupation as painter and distinguishing features as Little Moustache. A hotel in Boreham Wood and the basement of the Savile Row police station were turned into workshops where Jewish tailors made clothes and uniforms to match the locations of agents' deployments. The styles, materials, stitching, buttons and labels had to perfectly match the original country's schmutter. The quality and detail were so good that resistance members started putting in orders with their SOE contacts. Most important was the recruitment and deployment of agents. And while there's not much evidence that Jews were directly targeted as Jews for SOE work, their immigrant and refugee backgrounds, along with their motivation to serve, meant a good fit with clandestine operations requiring local, cultural, and language knowledge. Some examples. Adolf Rabinovich, codenamed Arnaud, was born to Russian Jews in Egypt. He studied in Paris and lived in the United States. In 1939, he volunteered in the French Foreign Legion, was taken prisoner by the Germans in June 1940, and escaped to Britain via Spain, where he joined the SOE. He undertook his first mission in France in 1942, and then a second in 1944, parachuting back in to a compromised landing site where he was wounded and captured. As a Jew, he was sent to the Gross Rosen concentration camp, where he died in the gas chambers. Isidore Newman was born in Leeds, studied French at university and trained as a primary school teacher. He joined the SOE via the Royal Corps of Signals and ran escape and supply lines in France. Like Rabinovich, he was captured on his second mission in 1944 and executed in Mauthausen 5 months later. Maurice Pertschuk was one of the few agents sent to an area where they were already known. With disguises not being enough in such circumstances, some of those underwent plastic surgery to modify their appearance. You can see here the changes to his nose, chin, jaw, and hairline. Maurice's parents had become British citizens after escaping the pogroms, and they moved back and forth between Britain and France before war broke out. He went to France first as an agent of the Political Warfare Executive, which produced and distributed propaganda and gathered intelligence. He switched to the SOE, carrying out sabotage and arms supply. In April 1943, he was betrayed by a double agent and was executed in Buchenwald in 1945, 13 days before the camp's liberation. His brother Peter also ended up in the SOE, though never deployed. Marcus Bloom from Tottenham was a radio operator in the same network as Pertschuk. He had learnt French working for part of his family's mail order business in Paris. Thanks to the historians Martin Sugarman and Paul McHugh, we have recently found out a lot more about Marcus's operations. At the outbreak of war, he returned to Britain, determined to enlist and put his knowledge to use. He was initially rebuffed due to a lack of physical prowess, but was ultimately snapped up by the SOE and completed his training despite the anti-Semitism of some senior officers, one of whom observed, "Physical effort seems to come hard to this pink yid," while another described him as slightly Jewish in his outlook and appearance. He deployed to France with Isidore Newman and helped destroy an explosives factory and derail a supply chain, as well as coordinating the return of British airmen via Spain. He was based at the chateau of an aristocrat who had hidden 35 tons of French military supplies on his estate, until the operation was betrayed by a double agent. Blum was handcuffed to a Spanish member of his group, and the pair leapt from a window and escaped across country. Arriving 12 kilometers away at what had been a pro-resistant gendarmerie, they were met by the Gestapo and rearrested. After being dragged, bloodied, through the streets of Toulouse, Blum was moved between and tortured in prisons in Paris and Silesia. He gave nothing away. In September 1944, he was marched with 46 other Allied agents down to the slave labour quarry attached to Mauthausen concentration camp. There, they were told to pick up rocks and run up the quarry's stairs of death, to be shot in the back under the pretense of stopping an escape. Marcus reportedly threw his rock at a guard before being gunned down. His official SOE write-up said that he was very courageous and fought to the finish. It is clear he did a good job for many months. His body was never recovered. At the start of the war, Vera Atkins, who had emigrated to London in 1937, was part of the British team which evacuated Poland's Enigma codebreakers with their reverse-engineered replica Enigma machines across the border into her native Romania, from where they made their way to France and Britain to teach the Allies cryptanalysis, a vital step in the eventual victory. She undertook various intelligence missions for the British in Europe in the run-up to the war, including for a then politically isolated Winston Churchill. In 1941, she joined the SOE's F, or French section, the largest part of the operation, and rose to become its intelligence officer, taking commission in the Air Force. She eventually ran the widest network of agents covering every corner and patch of France, as annotated here, as well as being responsible for all 37 deployed female agents, wherever they were based. She took personal responsibility for all her charges, performing their final security checks and seeing them off in the planes from which they would drop into their missions. After the war, she joined the search for the executioners of those who had been killed as part of the war crimes investigations and helped recover agents' remains. She died in 2000, aged 92. One of the unique features of the SOE was the prominent equal role played by women. In fact, it was arguably a superior role. At least at first, they attracted less suspicion because the Nazis considered women only good for Kinder, Küche, and Kirche. And they also lacked the bravado and machismo that, while an asset in conventional warfare, could prove fatal in clandestine adventures. As Selwyn Jepson, the SOE's most successful recruiter, said of his female recruits, they have a far greater capacity for cool and lonely courage than the men. Typical of such was Muriel Bick. Bick was born to French Jews in Ealing, West London, and spent parts of her childhood in France and Germany. She joined the Women's Auxiliary Air Force in 1942 and was recruited from there into the SOE. In April 1944, she dropped into France to work as a radio operator and trainer and to establish post boxes for contact should radios break down. She became ill soon after arriving, but continued to work all hours every day. After collapsing, her comrades finally found a resistance-friendly doctor who diagnosed meningitis. She was admitted to a nunnery hospital but died just 6 weeks after jumping in. But she squeezed a lot into those 6 weeks, and for her efforts she was mentioned in dispatches. After the war, papers came to light showing she had had a bout of meningitis as a child, a fact she had kept secret for fear it might have blocked her deploying. Denise Bloch was a French Jew who worked as a secretary at Citroën, the car manufacturer. Her manager was a Jewish resistance leader, and he recruited her into the SOE to work with a British radio operator. In 1943, she was smuggled to London via the Pyrenees and Gibraltar to train in the role herself. She dropped back into France in March 1944. Radio operations were incredibly dangerous. The Gestapo had refined the detection of signals. You had half an hour, basically, to set up, send messages, receive replies, pack up, and get away. Overall, Nazi counterintelligence in France was so effective that at one point, the operational life expectancy of SOE agents there was just 6 weeks. On one occasion, Denise was carrying her radio in the usual suitcase pack when about to travel on a bus. She saw a Gestapo inspection in progress at the bus stop So she engaged one of the officers in poor German, causing him some amusement, and asked him to hold her case while she bought a newspaper. She then showed her papers to a civilian inspector, returned for her case, and got coolly on the bus with no hindrance. Eventually, Bloch was arrested, tortured, and deported to the Ravensbrück's women's concentration camp, where she was executed in January or February 1945. Britain posthumously awarded her the King's Commendation for brave conduct, and her French decorations include the Légion d'honneur. Sonia Olchanowski grew up in Germany, Hungary, and France. In 1942, as the Vichy regime started its enthusiastic persecution of French Jews, she was arrested for deportation, ready to be moved to the death camps. Family contacts back in Germany managed to get papers and apply bribes to have her designated as having economically valuable skills, and she was released. She told her mother that she felt she had to do something to defend us. Others won't do it for us. We must do it for ourselves. She joined a Jewish subunit of an existing SOE network around Paris as a courier and saboteur. When it collapsed, rather than fleeing with comrades to Switzerland, she stayed to run what remained. In January 1944, she was arrested and, after an ordeal of several months in various prisons and camps in France and Germany, was executed on the 6th of July. The contribution made by Jewish women to the SOE is perhaps best captured by the memorial to the women of F Section at the National Memorial Arboretum in Staffordshire. It centres on a pine tree grown from a cone found within the old perimeter of the Natzweiler concentration camp, where so many SOE agents were killed. Around the tree, they have built a bench with plaques commemorating Vera Rosenberg, Vera Atkins, and the 15 women who died serving the executive in France. Only 4 of those names are Jewish, but this is the shape they chose for the bench. None of this sacrifice was in vain. In the run-up to D-Day, SOE-supported resistance networks in France carried out hundreds upon hundreds of acts of rail, road, and other sabotage, which severely slowed the advance of at least 8 German divisions to the front, allowing Operation Overlord to properly take hold in Normandy. And the executive was not just successful in Western Europe. Thought to be its last surviving member, Jack Mann, a British Jew born in Egypt and today a member of Northwood and Pinner Liberal Synagogue, spoke a ridiculous number of languages, 10 by some estimates, and began his war in the Royal Signals before transferring to the Long Range Desert Group. This was the unit that carried out raids and reconnaissance in the Western Desert, North Africa, and supported the early activity of the SAS. Indeed, LRDG veterans are considered veterans of that regiment too. Jack is pictured on the right here in his SAS Berry. From there, he joined the SOE and was involved in the operation that established it as a vital part of the war effort. Operation Postmaster in January 1942 was the mission to steal an Italian and a German merchant navy ship that had been transporting raw materials and arms to the Axis powers, while also spying on Allied vessels. The ships were in port at the Spanish colony island of Ferdinand Po, now known as Bioko, part of Equatorial Guinea. While the captains were ashore at a party organised by another British agent, Jack and his team entered the harbour in kayaks and on tugboats, boarded the ships, blew off the anchoring and stole them away, eventually to Nigeria, with their millions of pounds worth of cargo. All within half an hour and all without taking a single casualty. 250 Jews from the Yeshuv, the community in pre-Israel, volunteered for the SOE. 110 underwent training and 37 eventually infiltrated into Europe, mainly Eastern Europe and Italy. The Germans captured 12 and executed 7. Originally from Slovakia, Haviva Reich was one of 4 Yeshuv SOE agents who returned there to participate in the national uprising against the Nazis and to run escape and supply routes. Reich was killed in the massacres against partisan strongholds that took place to suppress the uprising in November 1944. During the night of May 12th to 13th, 1944, Rehavam Amir parachuted into the 4th Zone, an area southeast of Ljubljana, Slovenia, under partisan control, but surrounded by the Germans. Amir's official assignment was to find a lost British mission that had previously parachuted into the area, but had gone astray and had not been contacted. He was also assigned to improve the radio communication systems at the Partisans' headquarters and to further train them in communications and in coding. Uniquely for an SOE agent, there is a photo of him, top right here, actually on operations. He was also instructed unofficially to find fleeing Jews and help them escape to safety and freedom. Amir spent the summer months with the Partisans, marching from camp to camp. In September 1944, he left for HQ in Italy, but returned to Slovenia with further technical equipment and supplies. At the end of 1944, having been 3 times behind enemy lines, he returned home. He was later a diplomat, including 5 years as Israel's consul general to the UK. Arguably the most famous of these Jewish parachutists was Hannah Senesh. She'd immigrated to Palestine from Hungary in 1939, and in March 1944, she parachuted back into Yugoslavia with 2 male comrades to join the partisan resistance, enter Hungary, and save Jews from deportation to Auschwitz. On learning that the Nazi occupation of Hungary was complete, the men abandoned the mission as too dangerous, but Hannah persisted. She was arrested near the border by the Hungarian puppet authorities, imprisoned, tortured, tried for treason, and executed by firing squad in November that year. Throughout her ordeal, even when her mother was also arrested, she gave nothing away. On her cell wall, she left a poem. 1, 2, 3, 8 feet long, 2 strides across, the rest is dark. Life hangs over me like a question mark. 1, 2, 3, maybe another week, or next month may still find me here. But death, I feel, is very near. I could have been 23 next July. I gambled on what mattered most. The dice were cast, I lost. After the war, remains of 3 of the 7 parachutists killed, including Senesh, were interred in the National Military and Police Cemetery on Mount Herzl in Jerusalem. Memorials for the other 4 are also there. It is estimated that during its existence, the SOE employed 13,000 staff, 9,000 of whom were agents deployed to the field. But out of all those people, there was only one whose exploits particularly captured the attention of Churchill himself, and who his family later described as his favorite spy. Christina Skarbek was a former Polish beauty queen with an aristocratic father and a mother from a Jewish banking family. When war broke out, Christina was on holiday in North Africa. She journeyed immediately to Britain to offer her services in espionage. She was arguably an SOE agent before there was even an SOE. She was the first female agent of the British to serve in the field and the longest serving of all Britain's wartime agents. Her resourcefulness and success have been credited with influencing the organisation's decision to recruit more women as agents. Where to even begin with her service? Here is just a taste. December 1939, she went to Budapest to spy on Hungary's preparations to enter the war on the Axis side. At one point, she skied across the Tatra Mountains into Poland to reach her mother, Stefania, and persuade her to leave. Stefania refused, insisting on staying to continue her job as a teacher, and was later arrested and killed in prison. In Hungary, Skarbek met Andrzej Kowalski, a Polish army officer she had known in her youth. They formed a professional and romantic partnership, carrying out surveillance and organising intelligence couriers in Poland, Hungary, and Romania. In January 1941, they were arrested by the Hungarian police and imprisoned and questioned by the Gestapo. Skarbek feigned symptoms of pulmonary tuberculosis by biting her tongue until it bled. The Germans released them, and the British ambassador helped them flee to Cairo via Bulgaria, Turkey, Syria, Lebanon, and Palestine. Some of the information they gained had correctly predicted Hitler's invasion of Russia, but on arrival they were dismissed on suspicion of being too close to Polish intelligence, while the Polish government in exile resented them for being too close to the British. They eventually worked their way back into the SOE, Skarbek after missions in Cairo and Syria, and then returning to Britain to train formally. She infiltrated into southern France via Algiers to work as a courier for a network organising and supplying resistance fighters. After a failed rebellion against local Nazi troops, she fled to the Alps to support resistance on both sides of the Franco-Italian border. Using her skill and charm, she persuaded 63 Polish soldiers in the German army defending a fortress to swap sides, leaving their former comrades and all their munitions to be surrendered. When her commanders were arrested by the Vichy regime 2 months after D-Day, she went to the local Gestapo liaison officer and the Gestapo officer in charge, claiming to be General Montgomery's niece and threatening grave retribution if any harm came to the prisoners. She had 2 million francs airdropped to her for a bribe. The men were released and the Gestapo officer and his liaison deserted. As the south of France was liberated, Skarbek persuaded hundreds of more Poles serving with the Germans to surrender. When the Red Army advanced across Poland, the British government and Polish government in exile worked together to leave a network in place that would report on events in the country. Kowalski and Skarbek were preparing to be dropped into Poland in early 1945, but the mission was cancelled as the Soviets started arresting agents. As World War II gave way to the Cold War, the SOE was wound down and its operations were absorbed into MI6. Christina continued to seek a role with them, but incredibly, after all they had achieved in the previous years, the chain of command now regarded women like her as an annoyance, an encumbrance. She was offered administrative and secretarial roles, which, apart from anything else, she had no experience or skills for. Eventually, they paid her off with a month's salary of £100 and returned her to Civvy Street. She bounced from menial job to menial job, ending up stewarding on cruises. On one, she attracted the romantic attention of a merchant seaman called Dennis Maldoni. When the relationship ended, he did not take it well. On the 15th of June 1952, Maldoni tracked Christina down to the hotel she was living in between jobs. He confronted her in the lobby and stabbed her to death. She was due the next day to travel to Belgium for a reunion with Kowalski. Who knows what might have been? That hotel was, of course, the Shelbourne, where our story began, and that long abandoned trunk was Christina's, complete with the SOE-issued dagger. The campaign, led by her biographer and the Polish ambassador to the UK to place a blue plaque on today's site, finally got the go-ahead in March last year, the current owners objecting for years on the grounds it might put off guests. In September last year, Christina finally got her memorial. Let me leave you with two final thoughts, one not altogether serious, the other perhaps more relevant than we wish it to be as anti-Semitism rises once again. The SOE liaison to the Admiralty was a naval intelligence officer called Ian Fleming, and the executive and its exploits were a big part of the inspiration for his creation of James Bond. If he knew then what we know now about so many of the agents, who knows what might have been. That picture is taken from an article about the real-life Jewish agent Sidney Riley, born Sidney Rosenblum, the so-called ace of spies, and one of MI6's first operators in the Soviet bloc. But perhaps another story for another day. As anti-Semitism has once more reared its ugly head, we have seen all the slanders against us, old and new, re-emerge. One of the nastiest features of contemporary Jew hate is the lie of passivity in the face of Nazi persecution in the last century. As the Jewish military historian Martin Sugarman, who I previously mentioned, and to whom much credit is due for uncovering many of the tales I've told today, the courage of Jewish agents of the SOE disproves the anti-Semitic libel that Jews under Hitler went like sheep to the slaughter or avoided fighting. I'm a trained soldier in the Army Reserve. I've been on operations. I've read books on or seen films about dozens, maybe hundreds more. If I try really hard, I can just about imagine what it could have been like, perhaps to land on the Normandy beach, to patrol through a Belgian forest, or face a panzer division in World War II. But to do what these people did, as Jews, to literally drop into the jaws of Nazism, back in some cases, and spend hour after hour, day after day, having to be permanently on mission, I cannot even begin to comprehend the physical, moral, and intellectual courage that took. So let's end today with a small act of remembrance for them, and indeed all the agents of the SOE, whatever their backgrounds, by recalling the words embossed on their memorial outside Lambeth Palace, that their services were beyond the call of duty, and that in the pages of history, their names are carved with pride. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dan. Gosh, amazing stories of bravery and sacrifice. It's just unbelievable, and such young people in the main as well. It's just incredible. just a quick question from me, and I'll open it up in a minute. Are there any books written sort of on this particular subject of Jews in SOE? That so many books written. We had a talk a little while ago from a lady called Helen Fry, who talked about MI9. I don't know if you've come across it, Dan.
Yeah, no, I'm very familiar with Helen. I've seen her talk on a number of occasions.
Okay.
And she's done some incredible work on, I mean, World War II history in general, but particularly sort of the Jewish involvement in a number of different ways. So yeah, I mean, she's an incredible author and well worth reading.
Yes, I'm reading her book MI9, which I think eventually got absorbed into MI6 and worked closely together. It was all about bringing British servicemen back who'd been captured, and Harry Neve was the first British serviceman to escape from Colditz. Very fascinating story, and I've barely scratched the surface of it. Yeah. Are there any books that you could recommend that would give an understanding of what you've been talking about?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's sort of it's generally about the Jewish military contribution in general, but does have a focus on the SOE, and that would be Martin Sugarman's book called Fighting Back, about British Jewish contribution in the Second World War, and that's got quite a lot about the SOE in it. So that would be as good a place to start as any.
Okay, thank you. Right, let me open it up to further questions from people.
It was such a comprehensive talk that it's very difficult. I mean, he just was brilliant and gave us all the information, but obviously their private lives are not available for discussion or.
Well, we do know a little bit about their private lives. Again, thanks to historians like Martin Sugarman. We know Denise Bloch, for example, had while she was training in the UK, had a relationship with an Englishman who eventually died in a flying accident out in the Far East. And there's a rather poignant, on the anniversary of her death, there some rather poignant messages which before his death he'd actually placed sort of memorial notices in the Daily Telegraph every year. You know, of course, for a lot of them, the private lives, there was romantic involvement with other agents, but what made so many of them suitable for this sort of service was that they didn't really have relationships before entering service. They didn't have families of their own, which was what in many cases made them so, as I say, so fitting for these sorts of roles, as you know, as probably applies today for clandestine operations.
Jasmine,
you're muted.
You're on mute.
Okay.
Yeah, you're on now.
Thank you for such an interesting talk. You mentioned the plaque at the end at Lambeth Palace. Why is it there, and where can it be seen?
Okay, so the reason it's in Lambeth is that I did mention her briefly. She wasn't a Jewish agent, but Violet Jarboe, and I think at least 2 or 3 other of the female agents were actually from Lambeth. And again, there's a couple of memorials that reflect this. Again, Violet Jarboe was one of the sort of leading agents. She extraordinarily carried out 2 missions and was killed on her second. There is actually an estate in Lambeth where the tower blocks are named after female SOE agents. There was a campaign for many years to have one of them named after Denise Bloch, actually. And again, if you're familiar with that part of London, at the roundabout as you enter Lambeth by, I think it's Stockwell Tube Station, there is a mural that includes Violet Jarboe and also Inayat Khan, who was another one of the most famous female agents as well. So I don't know why particularly Lambeth Palace, but it's in Lambeth for that reason.
you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Any more questions for Dan?
Yes, I've got a question.
Who's that?
It's Marion Offenbach.
Okay, Marion, carry
Hi.
on.
Thank you very much, Dan. Very interesting talk. What was the name of the female agent that you said we should look up?
Oh, so that was Agnes Burnell. She wasn't actually an agent as such. She was the woman that was used under the pseudonym of Vicky to be a fake German Vera Lynn, and was used in the propaganda and psychological explanations. I've just dropped her name into the into the chat there for you.
Okay.
I mean, really, her post-war life was just as fascinating as her wartime exploits.
Thank you.
Any more questions for Dan? Dan, where do you do all your research? Is it through the Ajax records, or where do you get all this information from that is so deep and comprehensive?
So, as I say, I'm extremely grateful. I mean, Martin Sugarman has been, he's been the Ajax archivist and historian for decades now, and he's been writing particularly about the SOE agents for at least 25 years. And I know that he's a professional archivist and researcher. He's delved into the National Archives and everything else. The rest is my own research, from just trying to identify, again, from lists of SOE agents who might be the Jewish ones, and then just doing some online research to see what information exists for them.
Good. Okay, Dan. Thank you so much again for a very interesting.
Thank you very much for having me.
No, it's our pleasure. You're always welcome here, and I'm sure Daphne will be in touch with you sometime again in the future. So thank you very much.
I certainly will. And I want to say my personal thank you for agreeing to talk again. And
My pleasure.
it's just fascinating how brave those people were. You know, you wonder, would any of us have done any of those things? I wonder. But thank you very, very much. And it's lovely to see you again.
Nice to see you.
Take care, Dan.
Take care now. Love to the family.
Thanks very much.
Thanks,
Bye.
Dan. Right. Current affairs on Thursday. Our resident cook, Leslie Daniels, will be hosting you on Thursday. So look forward to that. And next Tuesday, we have Richard Cohen talking about Tesco's. Jack Cohen started Tesco's, as we know, back many, many years ago. He was the initiator of self-service grocers, as we were. And I think his strapline was "Pile it high, sell it cheap."
It was Victor Value, actually. It was called,
Sorry?
It was called Victor Value, I think, at that time.
Well, Victor Value was the other big chain at that time.
No.
Tesco's acquired Victor Value. It was a separate company.
Yes, they were separate companies at the time, but I think one would have Jack Cohen as the pioneer of self-service grocery stores. I suppose he wouldn't recognise today's supermarkets, would he? It's a world away from there. But my background is retail, and I started off one time working for a small self-service company called Charles Phillips. They were taken over by Tesco. So I did spend a few months working for Tesco's many, many years ago. So I look forward to hearing that story next Tuesday when we have Richard Cohen joining us to talk about the history of Tesco's. So enjoy the rest of the week. For those of you going to the South Coast, I hope you get a bit of sunshine.
Thank you very much.
And look after yourselves. Please feel free to stay on and chat should you now wish to do so, because there's a bit of time. If anybody wants to chat to each other, feel free to do so. But keep well and enjoy the rest of the week.